And Dan, I think we're at that time, we're reached 12:30 in the Congressman's time. And I think we have our critical mass of folks who have joined us, his constituents have joined us, and more will be joining as we start. But why don't you start off our program right now, Dan?
All right. Well, I think Lynn Jenkins is actually going to formally introduce you, Ron. But, I just say that as the old congressman from the 4th Congressional District, the one that you currently occupy, it's a pleasure to have you here and representing the great 4th Congressional District and the great city of Wichita, the air capital of the world, and a lot of other things as well. As a member of the Ways and Means Committee, you probably are on the prime committee in the Congress to deal with a lot of issues that we're talking about, and this organization is fully bipartisan. Lynn and I just wrote a piece for the Wichita Eagle on the importance of global engagement. So we're just delighted to be a part of this, and that you've agreed to join us in a very, very important thing, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. So with that, Jason, I'll turn it over to either you or Lynn for the formal introduction.
Thank you, Dan. I'll start, and then I'm going to turn it over to Congressman Jenkins as well. Thank you, Dan. Of course, we're honored to have you serve as co-chair of our Kansas Advisory Committee. I am Jason Gross, Executive Director of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. It's good to join with you all together today. We really miss seeing you all in person, but we are glad at least we have the opportunity to connect in this way. We're, of course, meeting at a very heavy time for the U.S. and the world. We're deeply saddened by the tremendous amount of suffering and loss and the health, economic, social inequities our nation's confronting today. But during these challenging times, we sincerely hope that you and your families are all safe and healthy. As we begin today's program, let me talk about a few logistics for you. Everyone who's joined us today, Congressman Estes's constituents, you're all on mute now, but we do want to hear from you later. So when it's time for Q&A, there are a couple of ways you'll get to ask questions. If you're joining us on your computers, you can hit the raise hand function in the Zoom participant window. If you're joining us by phone, you can hit *9 and I'll call on you. And if you prefer to write out your questions, there's a Q&A box as well where you can write those out. This year, USGLC is proud to celebrate 25 years of building a better, safer world. And I want to tell you a little bit about who we are for any new faces who have joined us today. We are over 500 American businesses and humanitarian organizations alongside our network of business, faith, military, and community leaders from all across the country. Our bipartisan National Advisory Council is chaired by Secretary Colin Powell and is made up of our nation's top national security and foreign policy leaders, including most every living former Secretary of State. Our National Security Advisory Council is co-chaired by Admiral James Stavridis and General Tony Zinni, and is comprised of over 200 retired generals, admirals, and flag officers. Our Veterans for Smart Power initiative is made up of over 30,000 veterans from across the country who are committed to strengthening our non-military tools. And what brings all of these diverse voices together is a firm belief that we live in an interconnected world and that America needs to be engaged globally to advance our interests here at home. We talk about why a tiny 1% of the federal budget, called the International Affairs budget, is one of the most cost-effective and powerful investments America makes. It's sometimes called our foreign aid budget, but it's so much more than that. It funds our diplomats and embassies around the world, support for key allies. It funds our efforts to tackle global health threats, humanitarian disasters, impacts of climate change, and the root causes of terrorism. It funds our work to combat corruption, to promote the rule of law, to advance democracy and our universal rights and freedoms. It funds our programs that open up new markets for American goods and services, and public-private partnerships that offer a hand up, not a handout, to millions around the globe. These programs are effective, they're accountable, and they're transparent, and they deliver for the American people. So we host forums like this with folks all around the country, and we see that across political spectrums, across state lines, Americans like you want to engage. COVID-19 has really underscored the importance of this fight, and we are so fortunate to be joined by an expert in Congress to help us think through these issues. And to introduce today's special guest, I'd like to welcome our other Kansas Advisory Committee co-chair, former Congresswoman Lynn Jenkins, to join us to do the honors of introducing our special guest of honor. There you are, Congresswoman Jenkins. Great to see you, and please do the honors.
Thanks, Jason. And I'm pleased to introduce our special guest and my very good friend, who you all know, Congressman Ron Estes. He's been hard at work addressing the challenges of COVID-19 over the past few months to help keep our fellow Kansans safe. Congressman Estes brings many years of both private and public sector experience to Congress, from his work at P&G and Koch Industries to serving as the Kansas State Treasurer. He understands the value of development and diplomacy alongside defense as a means to protect our national security and to promote and support American jobs. USGLC had the opportunity to host the congressman for a discussion last year in Wichita, and we're glad to be able to continue the conversation today, though under quite different circumstances, to be sure. Congressman, thank you so much for your service and for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to say a few words before we dive into questions.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, Lynn, for that kind introduction, and thank you for our years of friendship. It's been a long time. I joke with a lot of people about I've just been following in your footsteps in terms of being state treasurer and then going to Congress and then getting on the Ways and Means Committee. So that's kind of the process. I talk a lot with folks. And Dan, thank you as well for your remarks at the beginning, representing the district that I now represent. We've got a long history in Kansas of a lot of great representation, a lot of great individuals who stepped up and contributed way above our size in terms of population and just the impact that so many people have had on the value of the country. And I just want to take a step back and make a quick comment about how much the leadership role of the United States has changed. I mean, when you go back to World War II and you look at where the United States was before World War II in terms of being one of many countries versus our position afterwards, and how important a role that we have had since then in terms of setting a standard, being the flag bearer of where the world ought to go, and being a shining example of what things ought to happen, and help work to provide that leadership to help make sure that not only did we as a country prosper, but also help other countries throughout the world in so many ways. Obviously, things that we talk about on the Ways and Means Committee, trade and taxes and a lot of the healthcare issues are things that touch everybody, not just the United States, but it also affects everybody throughout the world. And we can't shrink from that role. We need to continue to stand up as a country. We need to make sure that some of the principles that we value as a country are ones that we can continue to promote and can continue to help and make sure that we as a country help other countries improve their process and improve their activities and their outcomes as well throughout the world, because it ends up making all of us stronger as we go through that. So I appreciate the opportunity today. I know I could continue on for a lot, but I know we have several questions to go through, and there's probably some questions from the group as well. So maybe I'll turn it back and we can continue on from there.
Thank you, Congressman. Great way to kick off to our conversation today. Obviously, your constituents who joined you again today understand the important role leadership you play in Washington for them. And we look forward to a great conversation this afternoon. We're going to focus on COVID-19 and America's role in the global response, why it matters to our interests and values, that we address this pandemic threat both at home and abroad, as well as other critical international issues. And then we'll open it up, definitely, some questions from your constituents. Congressman, I want to open up our discussion today with a quick video clip and then get your reaction right afterwards. We can line that up.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
Now, Congressman, that was Bill Gates 5 years ago, warning us we were not ready, and without a doubt, the world is still not ready today. 70% of the world remains unprepared to respond to the pandemic. 10 countries in Africa, for example, still have no ventilators. So as we discuss this global crisis, I'm reminded that Kansas has such a long legacy of producing leaders that understand why U.S. global leadership is so important, from President Eisenhower to Senator Dole to Secretary Glickman, who joined us earlier, of course, Secretary Pompeo right now, who also represented this district. And you're certainly no exception to that august line. Alongside addressing our urgent domestic challenges, why does America's leadership in the global response to COVID-19 matter for Kansas? Why is it in our interest locally to fight these infectious diseases around the world?
I think Bill Gates there highlighted something that, you know, I mentioned early on that, you know, after World War II, the United States took a big leadership position within the world. And of course, a lot of that has dealt with how do we grow the economy and how do we look at military issues? Because there still are individuals who are more interested in power than they are in making sure that there's freedom and democracy in their respective countries or their fellow human beings. And so as Bill mentioned in his clip there, that you know, our danger comes from other sources. And in this particular case, just looking at the virus and the impact there, what the coronavirus that has resulted in the COVID-19 has really highlighted is that we need to do a better job looking not just domestically, but also globally of what we do. And what is highlighted is that not just other countries, but also the United States in some ways is very unprepared. And I think we had, as a country and even respective states, had, I don't want to use the word window dressing, but we had the rudimentary basics there, but we actually didn't follow through with it. You know, we had strategic stockpiles of personal protective equipment and some medicines and ventilators. But when time came to needing to utilize those, discovered that in different states and in the nation, at the federal government, they hadn't been replenished due to budget cuts, due to lack of foresight and foreplanning and where we go. Luckily, we've seen a lot of things. A lot of people come to bear to jump in and help make sure that we can address that in the future. You know, companies, aviation companies here in my district are used to making airplane parts, rapidly converted over to making ventilators. Spirit Aerostructures is doing that. Aerosystems is doing that. Textron also making PPE equipment. And so our resilience as a country is able to react to these situations when they happen. One of the things I think we need to do once we get past the immediate medical crisis is let's take a step back. Let's gather our thoughts on the lessons learned and lay out where do we go moving forward, both from a standpoint of a commitment to support our strategic stockpiles, commit a process that ongoing we pay for to rotate the stock, which doesn't necessarily add extra cost, but it does add time and cost to manage that process. We need to go back and look at what our laws are in our governments at the state level, because so many of our laws were set up to address 1700s and 1800s when you had epidemics of yellow fever and other things that aren't necessarily the disease today. And how do we handle hotspots, and how do we make sure that not just that we have to and figure out ways to quarantine where those hotspots pop up, but then also provide the economic relief for them so that they can come back afterwards and still protect the rest of us that that haven't hit that position yet. And I'm optimistic. I think we're headed in the right direction. We've looked at so many things from a vaccine development and a treatment development. We know so much more now. I talk a lot with when I talk with groups around here as well as back in DC, is that we learned more almost on a daily basis through February, March, and April of how the disease worked and what happened. And that's one of those things that the more knowledge we had beforehand would have benefited us in a lot of ways in terms of having a clear and precise approach to address it to start with.
Right. And the complexity of our domestic response, as you said, is mirrored in what's going on globally right now for the developing world with fragile health systems and the way that we're keeping our eye on the ball here, but we don't want to see that this pandemic metastasize abroad, come back for a second wave here as well. So it's all these things you talked about, even in our society, how complex these are in fragile societies, developing world where they have even less advanced health systems. That's the kind of thing we got to keep our eye on as well to prevent that blowback, that second wave that we're concerned about. Let me bring in we have another panelist joining us today, special guest, Kathryn Unger. Here she is, Vice President for North American Government Relations for Cargill. Kathryn, thank you for joining us today. We're honored to have you serve, of course, as our Heartland Chair. I'd love to start off before you join us formally to share a new video about Cargill's important work with USGLC, and then we'll continue our discussion on the other side of this. So we have another video that's coming up right now.
National security and food security are deeply intertwined. I have a very unique background. I came from special operations. I'm also a large animal veterinarian that works for Cargill Health Technologies, specifically around supporting food security. And I also work in the Air Force as a reservist. I command a medical unit specifically designed to extract injured soldiers, sailors, and airmen and bring them home. It's a very rewarding job. I've been involved in combat operations. I've learned that if we have to get into a gun battle, we make 200 enemies. However, if you go into a region to feed their families, you make 200 friends.
We work for a leading global food and agriculture company. We know that when we invest in programs that help address food security and help improve livelihoods around the world, we're making a difference for those countries and those communities.
If we go in and we help make them sustainable, there's a win-win for America. We don't put our servicemen at risk, but we also work in a great partnership with USAID and other NGOs. When you help somebody and you make long-term friends, they see America as someone who cares about them, who cares about their family, who cares about their country.
Cargill partners with others to be able to reach scale. Organizations like the World Food Program, or CARE, or USAID. We can't do it on our own. One example of that is a partnership that we have called Hatching Hope. It has a bold, ambitious target to reach 100 million people through the production and consumption of poultry. And we're supporting She Feeds the World, which is an effort to reach 2 million women.
Food security isn't just about making sure that you're fed. Food security is the basis for where society can then go. Education for your children, your medical needs, these things track after you've been fed.
And so some of the work that we do in terms of farmer training, linking farmers to financing, ultimately linking them to markets, is how we can help smallholder producers around the world.
When you combine the will, the heart, the technology, you can change the world.
Well, Kathryn, after that great video, it's great to have you here. I just say to hear from you and kick it off, addressing food insecurity is even more important than ever in this global pandemic. I think we'd all agree. World Food Program Executive Director David Beasley was warning us that we could see famines of biblical proportions as a result of food crises brought on by COVID-19. Given that Cargill is an American company that is supporting communities both here in the US, but also around the world, can you expand on that idea and concern we have? Why is it in America's interest to be engaged in the global response to this pandemic and its repercussions?
Yeah, absolutely. And hello to the Congressman, welcome. And hello, good afternoon to you as well, Jason. Before I answer that question, if I could take one moment and just thank the local leaders in Kansas and in Wichita for their support during our protein headquarters site selection process. We're just so appreciative of the support they gave us during that. And we're so happy that we are able to continue to have the opportunity to grow together. So just want to say thank you to them. And of course, I have to say thank you to all of our Cargill employees in Kansas, in particular in Dodge City. What you all do every day makes Cargill proud. So thank you so much to all of our people in Kansas. So then back to your question, Jason. You know, as the Congressman was saying, during this COVID-19 crisis, our work as Cargill to nourish the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way has never been more important. You know, Cargill is a really big company. I didn't know that before I joined. Most people don't know, but every day 160,000 Cargill employees go to work in 70 countries. And in fact, during this pandemic, the resilience of our employees and the strength of our partnerships and with communities, customers, nonprofit partners, all of this has helped ensure that our farmers and ranchers have a market in which to sell their products, that fish and livestock operations can keep their animals fed, that grocers can stock their shelves and restaurants can feed their customers, and families around the world have food on their plates. And what Cargill does is literally that important. We're also proud to partner with our farmers and our retail customers and government leaders around the world to maintain the stability of the food systems we rely on for nourishment, but we're also securing markets for our farmers, ranchers, food producers, and they depend on those markets for their livelihood. And then just with the pandemic, and that's what Cargill does every day, but the pandemic demands that we do more. Cargill and the United States have the unique ability and responsibility to lead during this global crisis. And that's why we as Cargill have taken an active role in supporting communities here and around the world where we live and work. You know, we've donated more than 3 million pounds of food to alleviate hunger here and abroad. And in the US, we're supporting the World Food Program USA, Action for Healthy Kids, the American Farmland Trust's Farmer Relief Fund, the American Restaurant Employee Relief Fund, and local food banks all over. So as the Congressman said, what we're doing is important for making all of us stronger, both here and abroad.
Great. Congressman, that's a great start for both of you for our conversation today. I want to talk to one of our pillars at USGLC we talk about, that's national security. And let's talk about the risk. If we don't get this all right, we're in big trouble. You know, COVID-19 is exacerbating instability in fragile states around the country, as we discussed earlier, could have serious repercussions long-term for our safety at home. You foreshadowed some of that earlier about we have to keep our eye on the ball on a lot of national security issues at this time, even the pandemic. Extremist attacks in sub-Saharan Africa have increased by 37% from recent Pentagon reports. And the Pentagon's warned of a potential resurgence of ISIS in Syria due to all this instability. There's a challenge that can't be solved by military alone, I think we'd all agree, but requires our development, our diplomacy, and our global health programs. You're the son of a veteran, McConnell Air Force Base in your district. Can you speak to how our national security challenges overseas are heightened by this global pandemic and why we can't ignore them without the ramifications?
Yeah, I mean, that's so relevant when you have a time of instability just related with the pandemic. It creates opportunities that folks that want to create mischief, want to cause trouble, they have evil intent in their plans to take advantage of. And as you said, there's a lot of strength and power that we have on the military side, but we can't lose sight that in some ways part of the best defense strategy that you can have is actually working on the front end to build those relationships, build the friendships, and make things addressed as you can. And you know, we look at the pandemic. We've got more cybercrime activities happening out there. We got a whole host of other humanitarian issues that are affecting all of us, and we have to continue to use our position, our ability as a global leader to help make sure that we address those, that we maintain those working relationships around the world, and help. At the end of the day, it's going to end up with a better national defense because of that, and better security around the world. One of the things we do have to focus on a little bit more, probably is an area that we need to look a little bit closer on, is that as a national government, we're looking more for private industry to do more things. Mm-hmm. And when you end up having private industry that then has to rely on some countries and some locations that are adversaries like China and others, we have to come back and revisit what our processes are, and making sure that we have good supply chains and address those issues so that, as well as helping them have jobs. Because one of the things I always talk a lot about is that there's going to be a lot more security and stability in places where there's good economic value. And you see that a lot in trade, but just having that good economic value, that people have a willingness and a desire to support themselves and support their families, and an opportunity and a means to do that, then they're going to end up being living in a more stable community, a more stable country.
Complex world environment right now made by this pandemic. We have to have all of our tools at our disposal. So you talked about diplomatic tools that are there, long-term development, and those economic tools that we forge, and making sure that we're trying to modernize as much as we do our assistance through public-private partnerships. It's great to have Cargill on to talk about that too, because this is our new way of doing foreign assistance. It's not just U.S. government led solely. It's working with NGOs, with private businesses. And it's a great segue over to Kathryn. I mean, global hunger was on the rise even before COVID-19, and we now know that people facing starvation could double to over maybe 265 million this year across the globe. We just heard in the video, global hunger isn't just a humanitarian concern. It's a national security and food security are deeply interlinked, as we heard. So I just want to ask you, from your work at Cargill, where have you seen these connections between hunger and conflict, and how does addressing food security ultimately benefit our national security here at home?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, as the Congressman was saying, it really all boils down to one thing. By addressing poverty and food insecurity at home and overseas, we improve our national security here at home. You know, many of the conflicts that we see around the world are fueled by famine, food insecurity, ongoing instability, and so much of what goes into stabilizing these weak and fragile centers around food, including food shortages, price hikes, climate change. You know, when you think about even Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have to satisfy all of the basic needs first, food and security, before people can advance and start to really reach self-actualization and do other very positive things. These are all issues on which the United States can step up and lead, and we believe Cargill plays a role in that leadership as well, and we believe other private sector partners like us should do so. And when we promote stability and economic development overseas, especially in some of the world's fastest growing markets, we create more customers for our own companies and producers here. 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States. And so if our farmers are going to have markets that continue to grow so that we have somewhere to sell all of this wonderful produce and other product that we make better than anyone else here, we need to make sure that we're helping to take care of those economies and stabilize those abroad. It's a win-win. It's not just the right thing to do. It's not just that it feels good. It's a win-win for all of us.
Absolutely. And I would just say, turning to Congressman right now, we're talking national security, also economic growth too. Such an important part. You referred to this as well. I mean, we're seeing the effects of COVID-19 around the globe, a recession that's happening, and we're facing an economic challenge right now at home and abroad. You know well, Congressman, Kansas' economy depends on exports. over 2 billion in aircraft parts, over 500 million in wheat last year. 50% of US exports nationally going to emerging markets, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, now being really ravaged by this pandemic. So walk us through that. How is our economic future tied to the recovery of emerging markets? And why is it so critical on that diplomatic, that economic side for the US and our partners abroad, our allies, to step up and make sure that we have somewhere to go when we're getting out of this, this economic recession? We got to export our stuff around the world. We need to make sure those markets are healthy and vibrant, not being ravaged by the pandemic.
That's right, and we've seen a lot of instances in the United States as well as elsewhere in the world where the COVID-19 has created such a disruption in things. When you think about grocery stores within the United States and being shortages of items for several weeks there as things were really tightening up, we've seen it in the meat packing facilities where they've had some hot spots flare up and the potential impact in terms of that. But as you noted, we as a state and in general the United States has benefited so much from free and fair trade, and that's one of the things that we push and talk a lot in the committee, and working on how do we go and where do we go and what do we need to move forward. And I want to take a step back and make a comment on some past, and then how do we translate that into the future. You know, part of our problem is, and I made reference to it and we were talking about the national security, is that we want to make sure we have vibrant consumers for the products that we spend, but in a stable environment. And so, you know, in the 90s when NAFTA was drawn up and when China entered the World Trade Organization, you know, it was an optimistic time in the United States. It was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union dissolved, and there was a lot of hope that there was going to be a lot more freedom for everybody throughout the world. And so the way those particular trade agreements end up being developed was that under the assumption that there'd be a good opportunity for consumers to benefit in China, a good opportunity for jobs in Mexico, incomes to grow, and a better middle class there. And that neither of those quite panned out as strongly as we wanted to. And so now when we look and move forward, we want to say, okay, how do we take those lessons learned? How do we implement that and improve moving forward? And I had the opportunity last fall to go over and have a meeting with some of the folks in the World Trade Organization, and it was Ways and Means Committee members, both Democrats and Republicans, who went over there and talked a lot about the benefit of the WTO, the benefit of where we can continue to grow, not just the United States, but also how it benefit other countries in terms of that economic growth. And there's some restructuring that needs to happen with the WTO. I mean, we're in the 21st century now, and it was developed and in prior times, and so some of the things need to be changed there. But I think without any dissent, we all agreed that if the WTO didn't exist, we'd have to invent something like that as an organization to help spread this economic growth, economic prosperity around the world. One of the things I had the opportunity, and I hadn't really seen the numbers, and as a former state treasurer, I like to deal with numbers a lot, but we talked about, we were talking with some folks from the World Economic Forum and talking about trade in general, and that once, decades ago, five decades ago, when we were looking at 60 to 70% of the people in the world lived in poverty. And as we've promoted trade, as we've allowed trade to grow, that number's dropped now to less than 30% of the people throughout the world. And so that just highlights how important that value of trade, how important it is to have that good economic growth, and how much it benefits so many people's lives, both from the standpoint of how they live, how they raise their family, and also gives them the means to help be prepared as much as we can when a pandemic like the COVID-19 develops. And so we're more prepared and able to react to that.
Thank you, Congressman. Kathryn, from the private sector point of view, you mentioned Cargill's protein headquarters located in Wichita. You have a massive global exporting presence, accounting for 25% of all U.S. wheat exports overseas. Today's economic challenging outlook, to say the least, a new IMF report predicting the global economy could decline by almost 5% this year alone, worse than initial estimates. Can you share your outlook, concerns about the global economic outlook in the months to come, and how Cargill is going to be adjusting to that with these key export markets for your company?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I loved the statistic that the congressman shared about the reduction in poverty with the increase in trade. That's just, it really reinforces our belief that one of our most impactful tools for development and diplomacy, again, reducing that poverty, reducing that instability, is trade. And it's also one of our most important tools for, again, achieving that zero hunger. So if you have your three food security pillars, you've got access, nutrition, and stable supply, they're impossible without trade, because that's really what's driving all of this. It helps people in developing nations advance beyond mere subsistence and enter the consumer class. Again, think trade, think buying products. And that generates that demand for those goods, and agriculture definitely benefits from that. Again, when you think about the fact that the overwhelming majority of the consumers live outside of the US, and many of those are in our fastest growing markets, trade and supporting trade makes sense. And it's why Cargill remains very supportive of free trade. So building up those developing nations through investments in development, farmer training, building schools and infrastructure, and developing meaningful relationships across border, it improves people's lives, but again, also builds new markets. And all of that is in the interest of our farmers here in America's heartland. So I keep saying we do it because it not only feels good and it's the right thing to do, it's also good for our farmers, who we're always trying to support here at home.
So absolutely. As we saw that video crystal clear in your remarks today, really
That's right.
they go hand in hand. Third pillar, USGLC, we talk about when we engage in the world is, of course, our values as a people, our humanitarian values. I want to speak to those and actually turn to your constituents for a quick question, Congressman, to see how they see this crisis, just for them to vote on right now. This is according to one of the leading NGOs, the International Rescue Committee, up to how many people in the world's 34 most conflict-affected and fragile states are at risk of contracting COVID-19. So in those 34 most fragile conflict states, either we're talking about 100 million at the risk, 500 million at risk, or 1 billion. You can vote right now on your screen, and we'll see the answer in a second of how what everyone thought here. You see the answer? Your constituents know it. The majority there picked what is a frightening number, is now 1 billion folks around the world in conflict-affected and fragile states at risk of contracting COVID-19. Staggering humanitarian crisis that we're in the midst of. Congressman, I'll turn to you on this. Over 80 million displaced people around the world, representing 1% overall of humanity on this globe, a figure that's doubled over the last decade. Displaced people, of course, are especially vulnerable to infectious diseases. They face cramped, unhygienic living conditions, lack of access to medical care. You visited refugee camps, I believe, in Jordan, have advocated for displaced religious minorities in the Lake Chad region. Tell us and your constituents, how does support for displaced peoples, especially in the face of this pandemic, represent the best of America's moral leadership around the world, would you say?
Well, it really is, as you said, reflects who we are as a people and our humanitarian aspect of being able to support others and work with our fellow human beings and the issues that are most critical for them in the life that they're living. And we've seen, I think, a bigger issue with refugee issues over the last decade or so, 10 to 15 years. And I think part of that, we probably had a slight shift in policy. The world had a slight shift in policy that in hindsight may not have been appropriate. And instead of trying to resolve the issues, the traditional approach with refugees was resolve their issues in the home country, temporarily have refugee camps set up and addressed, and then allow them to return back home. And that's overwhelmingly what I saw when I was in the Syrian refugee camps in Jordan, and our conversations with them and the focus groups that we had that we were able to get together is that they wanted to return home. They wanted to have a safe environment and the conflict over. I think one of the mistakes the world, the UN, and some of the other relief agencies have done is trying to take the refugees out of their home and disperse them in other countries. And there's a need for that in some situations, but I don't think that should be the primary driver. What we end up doing is taking some of the leaders and taking them out of their country so that they're not back to help redevelop that and to help that country grow. And so it's probably a policy that we need to come back and revisit. There's so many things now when you look at people that want to exert undue influence or power and control. And there's a lot of organizations that are doing great work. I know here in the district, there's a large footprint of the In Defense of Christians organization that actually focuses on how do we help not just Christians, but also religious minorities around the world that are persecuted because of that, and making sure that one, they're cared for both from a food standpoint and housing, but also from a health support as well.
Great, Congressman. Well, great start to our conversation. Let's turn it over to your constituents right now. Let's hear what's on their minds right now. Again, as a reminder, you want to hit that raise hand feature in the participants window if you want to ask a question. If you're joining us by phone, *9. And if you want to write out your questions, the Q&A dialog box as well. I think we have someone already who's queued up right now. Matt Teagarden, I think you're going to ask a question. If you can unmute your line and let's hear your question.
Thanks, Jason. I think I'm unmuted. Congressman, you bet. Thanks. Congressman, thanks for doing this town hall. Appreciate your insight. I wanted to drill down a little bit more specifically. You mentioned China earlier, and we talk a lot about China from a trade perspective, and that's a market that we're excited about getting into, and specifically animal proteins and beef in particular going forward. But I think in addition to that, there's long-term implications in terms of China's engagement in developing countries. And so what do you see as at risk if the U.S. steps back from involvement in developing countries and China moves in to fill that void? And maybe what non-military tools, specifically development and diplomacy, can be used to ensure our standing is enhanced, maintained or enhanced in these areas?
Thanks for the question, Matt, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I think this is one of our key risks for the 21st century and beyond, is if the United States steps back away from being that global leader and allowing China to fill that void that we have left. And you've seen it with the Chinese policy on the Belt and Road Initiative, where actually they're aggressively going out and developing new working relationships, both from a manufacturing, from a trade, from a infrastructure as well. And of course, those scenarios are set up that provide an advantage for China more so than it does for the country that the projects are going into. And so we as a country need to step back up into that leadership role. We need to maintain those relationships, and in some cases build them if they didn't exist, or rebuild them if they were there and we've allowed them to lapse, and fill that need because there's so many places that we feel that the responsibility. Had the opportunity to go to Djibouti a couple of years ago, And we were on a trip. Actually, we went to Kuwait over Thanksgiving to see some of the Kansas National Guard troops that were there, and actually served them Thanksgiving lunch there. But in the time that we were there, we were in Djibouti, and that was on the Horn of Africa, where China has located their first base outside of mainland China. And so obviously they're wanting to put a footprint in there through so much of the world. And so I'm really pleased that the Ambassador Lighthizer on the Trade Reps office is actually making an aggressive effort to develop a trade agreement with Kenya. Granted, it's a small thing compared to some of the other things that we look at. But it's going to be a good footprint to put down in terms of saying the United States wants to re-engage in Africa and do that. I personally also believe we need to go back and revisit the Pacific Indian Rim countries and have. I believe we need a multinational agreement. I mean, it may not look exactly like the TPP that was being talked about before, but we can't step away from that. And it's such an important part of the world now in terms of not just the economic growth there, but also as a trade route to get to other parts of the world. And so we need to be engaged. We need to continue our leadership as a country to be involved in that and help make sure that our products, from airplane parts to grains and meats and proteins get distributed throughout the world.
Comprehensive answer there from the Congressman. Kathryn, I mean, China is such an important export market for the United States, but at the same time, as Matt referred to, we have strategic economic rivalries with them as well. They're competitors, and we've seen the amount of investment and time they've placed in Latin America and Africa right now. And what does that say about where we need to, keep pace, basically? And are we keeping pace, and how do we keep pace with that? Because those are vital markets for U.S. exporters in the next century as well.
Absolutely, they are. And with respect to Cargill, our goal is to make sure that we are present both physically in many of the important economies that we need to be in, and also that we have open and free export and trade with those economies. And I think that there will be both public, as the representative mentioned, and private investments that will be needed to be made to help stabilize and secure those economies. A great deal of the progress that has been made in China over the past 25 years has been specifically because companies like Cargill and other companies have invested there and have hired employees there and have brought our values and our beliefs to those areas. And I believe that kind of ongoing investment and open and free trade are going to be needed to continue to develop those economies, but also to grow our presence and give us an opportunity to share who we are and how we engage. And just a very simple example of that, when we do volunteer work in countries like China and other countries, because those are our values as Cargill, it's what we do. Sometimes those employees have never done volunteer work. It's not something, that necessarily is part of the culture. We get to bring that culture there and make it a part of our company culture there. And in so many ways, us being present in these communities is going to have a stabilizing effect. And we have to do more of that, not less, as well as investing here, by the way, in the United States.
I mean, that's a public-private partnership that we trumpet, is the private sector doing its role, and the public and our government, our public sector doing its role too. And that's about our diplomatic presence, advocating for U.S. interests, a robust one in Africa and Latin America, being there on the ground. Our embassies are really capable diplomats, and it's Congressman Estes, doing his job as a leader in Washington and Congress, visiting the Horn of Africa and Djibouti and seeing where Chinese influence is there, visiting our troops who are, putting their lives on the line, on the front lines for us in the Middle East. These are that public presence, that American flag being there is so important for our interests abroad, and to make sure that we're not losing pace with our allies and our adversaries who see great economic growth opportunities in the developing world, and we need to keep pace going on. I got another question from Karen Page has raised her hand. Karen, if you want to let us know who you are too and ask your question.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, Congressman. It's good to see you. It's been far too long, even though this is virtual. It's really lovely to see your face live. And Jason, thanks for hosting this important meeting. I always anticipate learning something, affirmation of the work that we're doing by USGLC, and today is no exception. Kathryn, I look forward to working with you. We work with some of the folks here in Wichita and have a long relationship with Cargill over the years, and deeply recognize the importance of Cargill's efforts locally and globally. So I have a question that centers around public and private partnerships, but also informally so. But before I ask that question, I just wanted to acknowledge that today there's a joint statement from Ambassador Lighthizer and Cabinet Secretary from Kenya, Betty Maina, announcing formally now the negotiations between the U.S. and Kenya for a free trade agreement. So to Congressman Estes' remarks earlier, this really signifies the importance of the Trump administration is placing on re-engaging with the African continent. And if this deal is done, a free trade agreement is actually completed, then that will be the second country from the African continent with which the United States has a free trade agreement. It speaks directly to those relationships on trade and economy with developing nations. In particular with Kenya, I think what we'll see is a greater emphasis on capacity development, which really is the trade, lingo for a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. I lead Kansas Global Trade Services. We are a full service advisory firm, and what we do is we help companies experience a seamless and profitable transactions for exports primarily, but we also help on the supply chain side. How we do business is by partnering with so many organizations like USGLC to not only amplify our voice, but also increase the access to tools for the clients that we serve in Kansas and in the Midwest. And thinking about combating COVID-19 and how we all have limited resources, but thinking about our role from the private sector and being crucial to complementing the work done by governments and large organizations globally. How do these partnerships really leverage the strengths of both the public and private sector, and then really make our efforts to tackle these global challenges like global COVID-19 even more effective? And then secondly, perhaps more importantly for the congressman, is how can Kansas businesses get involved in these efforts so that we're really helping to tackle the challenge in a meaningful way, both from the economic side, so they're going to be looking at economic solutions in this very challenging time, but really speaking to the three pillars of USGLC for humanitarian efforts, but also food and national security.
Thank you, Karen. Congressman, we have one more question. We're getting a little bit end of time right now. So how about I have Alan Cobb also want to ask a question. How about if I have Alan ask his question, and then you can answer Karen's and Alan's questions together, just so we keep on time and stick to our time frame too, if that's okay. Thanks. Alan Cobb, you had a question as well. Do you want to throw that in?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Jason, for hosting this, and thank you, Congressman Estes, for everything you're doing. Hopefully my audio is working.
We hear you.
I had the opportunity to be an election observer in Ukraine in 2014. It was a wonderful experience. A lot of Ukrainian Americans. I was not a Ukrainian American, just an American that was able to observe. And obviously the United States has been able to, through the Peace Corps and other programs, been able to increase its footprint across the globe. And just wondered if you had any comments on how those programs, particularly Peace Corps, are being perceived, and the importance of those volunteer opportunities. I certainly encourage anybody to be an international election observer if you have the opportunity. It was great opportunity for me.
So two different questions there, sir. We got, Karen's questions about how how can Kansas businesses really get involved in this global economy as effectively as possible to make sure that we're doing the best export? And also from Alan, the role of our citizen diplomats or Peace Corps volunteers, and how important that is for our global citizen diplomacy out there as Americans that we're doing around the world. So two little different questions, but still about how do we stay involved as Kansans in the global world?
Yeah, getting our country, our companies involved in that. I mean, obviously, part of what we've done is help make sure on the healthcare side that we seek out cures, we seek out treatments, and a lot of Kansas companies have joined that effort. I mentioned earlier about some of the aviation companies making ventilators and that. I think beyond that, when we think about trade. Obviously, we've got to continue to promote and use the resources that we have through the U.S. Trade Rep's office, through some of our export capabilities and export programs, and a lot of the work that Karen and her company does, the organization does, is to help so many of our local companies to navigate some of that paperwork and those issues, and continue to help. We'll continue to help do that. Obviously, there's been a bit of disruption with COVID-19 and the whole impact in terms of the export markets in general have been disrupted in some dynamic through that. And some of the trade realignments that have gone on even before COVID-19 has affected some of that as well. And so we've got to continue to re-engage once we get the economy reopened and moving forward. As far as Alan's comment, I think what I've seen from certainly from a foreign services side, from our embassies and support there, obviously that's such an important role. I'm a big believer in having good, strong working relationships in anything you do, whether it's work, whether it's politics, whether it's in your church, whether it's in international affairs. And so that's a lot of what our foreign service does. And as both Alan and Kathryn mentioned as well, is that being able to demonstrate some American values, whether it's through volunteers, through Peace Corps, through company volunteers, and just showing that this is kind of the life that we live, the values that we have as a country and want to build upon, and help support other human beings throughout the world is reflects positively on the United States.
Amen to that, Congressman.
And if I could just back on that, Jason, one quick comment. The thing that participating in USGLC, the reason it's so important to me is because when the U.S. doesn't lead, whether it's public, private, with our values, whatever, someone else, we create a void. And when we create a void, someone will step in to fill that void. And it's much better when it's the U.S. and our values and the way that we lead than it is oftentimes when it's maybe someone else. So let's not create that void. So
true. You guys singing from the same song sheet on that one. Our time draws late. Congressman, we've had a lot of heavy talk today, certainly. It's the topics of the day, looking at home and abroad, but let's try and end on a positive note if we can. You expressed some hope earlier, but I just want to drill down that a little bit more. In these challenging times, what is giving you hope that we can rise to the challenge of stopping the spread of COVID-19 in its tracks, rebuild our economy, provide hope to Americans during this uncertain time? What's giving you the most hope these days as we look over the horizon?
You know, we've seen such dramatic work and such outstanding work from so many people in the healthcare side and the first responders to the doctors, the hospitals, and just showing the effort that they've put in to help support all the folks that were suffering through this dynamic. And the same stories been repeated, and I've heard over and over again from other countries throughout the world in terms of the same thing as well. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we learned more on a daily basis about what the virus did, how it reacted, what was the best treatment. We know more today, and you know, we talked a lot about ventilators early on, of needing so many of those, and what the treatment is now is not to put them on a ventilator until the really severe cases come in, because of the reaction to the ventilator itself is causing some unexpected or undesirable health situations. Learned about the blood thinners, that the blood clots have become a bigger and bigger issue, and so use of blood thinners is a much more better treatment in terms of that process. So there's just so much more knowledge that we have now in terms of talking with some of the medical community. A lot of the funding that we've done through the CARES Act and some of the other acts providing for vaccine development and treatment development. There's expectations now that there can be a vaccine by the end of this year. And heard that even this week from Scott Gottlieb, who former FDA administrator, now on Pfizer's board, who's one of the companies that's actively involved in that. So there's, as well as herd immunity, in terms of getting to the point where enough people have had it and recovered that when the virus, which is going to continue in the world. I mean, we saw it with SARS, we saw it with the MERS, 8-10 years ago, and now it's here with COVID-19 disease. So we've got to get to that point where we've got vaccines, we've got treatments, we understand, and we're getting there, and getting more people that have recovered, so that the virus will not be able to be transmitted as readily as it has been.
Thank you, Congressman. As Karen Page said, I mean, we learn something every time we hold one of these dialogues, and certainly your constituents were reminded again of your comprehensive understanding of what our nation faces at home and abroad in terms of fighting COVID-19, and your leadership in Congress. And we're grateful for your time. Kathryn, thank you for your time as well today. It was a great discussion. I want to close it out, turn to my colleague, J.M. Ancianzo, who's our Central Director and for USGLC. Thank everyone, and JM, take it away and close us out today.
Thanks very much, Jason. Thanks, Congressman Estes. Thanks, Kathryn, for a terrific conversation. Congressman, thanks for your continued leadership on these issues on Capitol Hill, but especially back in the district, communicating to constituent leaders why these issues matter back here at home. We really appreciate it. And a special shout out to your team, Debbie, Roman, and everybody else for making what was an in-person scheduled event, now a virtual event, terrific. Thanks very much to Secretary Glickman, Representative Jenkins for joining us, terrific co-chairs of our Kansas Advisory Committee, to our Advisory Committee members who are on the call, our Veterans for Smart Power, Alan Cobb at the Kansas Chamber, Karen Page at Kansas Global Trade Services for partnering with us for the event. Many thanks. And just a huge shout out to folks in Kansas, especially Southeast Kansas. Miss visiting you. We got to do things virtually now, but Southeast Kansas was the first place I visited in the state, and I miss it, especially now during harvest time. So hopefully sooner rather than later we'll get together. But one more reminder, please try to join us next week, July 15th, for a conversation with former Defense Secretary Bob Gates, another Wichita native. Something is going on in Wichita with global leadership. Just another thanks, and folks, be safe, thinking about you, and hope to visit soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you, Congressman.
Bye. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. And Kathryn, it's good to be on with you. I mean, Cargill is such an important part of our community and the state and the world. So appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for all you do.
See you all soon.